This is the eLearn podcast. If you're passionate about the future of learning, you're in the right place. The expert guests on this show provide insights into the latest strategies, practices, and technologies for creating killer online learning outcomes. My name's Ladek, and I'm your host from Open LMS. The eLearn podcast is sponsored by eLearn Magazine, your go-to resource for all things online learning. Click-by-click how-to articles, the latest in edtech, spotlight on successful outcomes and trends in the marketplace. Subscribe today and never miss a post at elearnmagazine.com. And Open LMS, a company leveraging open source software to deliver effective, customized, and engaging learning experiences for schools, universities, companies, and governments around the world since 2005. Learn more at openlms.net. Hello, everyone. My name's Ladek, and my guest for today is John Hackmeyer, who's been in the e-learning space for more than 20 years. He's worn a lot of different hats as an engineer, an instructional designer and content creator, a sales enabler, and as the founder of Cyber Crocodile, from which he advises companies large and small around the world about all things online learning. In this Take My Advice conversation, John and I talk about what exactly is sales enablement in general, and how to use the techniques John espouses to effectively create revenue for your company or institution. We then talk about, the problem of when considering purchasing a learning management system or an LMS, the difference between choosing a provider and a partner. What are the business needs that you really have in the immediate term, the midterm, and the long term, and what integration possibilities exist with that LMS you're considering? And then ultimately, you've got to ask yourself as an institution, where do you want to spend your time in terms of LMS administration? Next, we talk about how do you prevent buyer's remorse, right? So what are the criteria you can set out to ensure that you get what you need from an LMS? We also cover some of the most common must-haves from any conversation with an LMS provider that are really red flags if they're not available. Things like asking for a trial or start using support before you're actually a client of theirs, and asking how technical help is provided. John and I then talk about the critical nature of being able to reach a human with any LMS provider when you have a problem, whether or not you should expect to be treated with, really special, like a snowflake, and receive that red carpet treatment, or are you just kind of one in the crowd of the people that they serve, and what you should really ask for when you are speaking with references. We also talk about what to look for and ask about when it comes to security around your LMS provider that you're considering. And I encourage you to hold on to your seat for this one, because John gets really technical and goes really deep into the weeds on this one, and how certification around security separates a good provider from a great provider. John also takes on this topic from both sides of the table. So not only from the purchaser, but also from the provider side, to talk about how providers can actually put their best foot forward when it comes to security. We round out our conversation with talking about how forgiving you should consider being as someone who is the client if your provider experiences a security breach, and what you should expect as a response from someone when a security breach does happen, because we all know it's going to happen. And remember, we record this podcast live so that we can interact with you, our listeners, in real time. So if you'd like to join the fun every week on LinkedIn, on Facebook, or on YouTube, just come over to elearnmagazine.com and subscribe today. Now, I give you John Hackmeyer. Fantastic. Well, why don't we start by actually telling people who you are. So you're John Hackmeyer. They can see on the screen there, Cyber Crocodile. Yeah. Tell us about, I know who you are. People who work at Open LMS know who you are. There's many people in the e-learning universe, the online universe, sort of a remote work universe, that know who you are. But for those people who aren't listening, why don't you give us the 30 seconds, 1 minute on kind of where, who you are and where you sit today. Like, what is it that you do?
Sure. Well, anybody who's watching can tell that I'm old, so we know that. We got that established. And so
scary.
I started off in this career field actually as a systems engineer, and was doing systems engineering for several years. Then eventually went out on my own and wanted to do some teaching, some instructional design work, content development, et cetera. And then eventually moved into sales enablement and was a sales enablement leader for a number of years. And then I decided to go full-time back into consulting, which is what I'm doing now. And it's a combination of instructional design, content development, sales enablement, consulting, and even back from the old days of doing my cybersecurity stuff, I still teach, a cybersecurity certification prep course. So that's kind of what's been going on.
Do you teach it at is that like a course that you own, or are you teaching it through an institution?
Yes, probably to both. I have right now, I'm only teaching it for a major customer that I have. But the reality is that, anybody that needed me to teach it, technically I could.
Okay. All right. No, that's great. All right. I want to start our conversation today with a place that we actually don't normally talk about here. Or actually, quite honestly, I was kind of racking my brain to see if we've talked about this before, but sales enablement, right? So you've done this before. This has been, you said it's still something that you consult on and whatnot. First of all, what does that mean? For those of us who aren't sitting in an institute of higher education or a corporation or something like that, like what does that mean in the first place?
Yeah, it's a great question, because to this day, sales enablement still isn't perfectly defined in one way. And the term itself has only been around maybe for about a decade or so, give or take. And not everybody agrees. But what I would say is that the overarching idea of sales enablement is being able to come up with a way to train and educate your salespeople and oftentimes sales engineers, both internally and partner organizations, which is very common as well. And how do you create a program that allows them to come in as new hires, get ramped up efficiently and effectively, and then be able to grow from there as they stay with the company? As products and services change rapidly. And how do you keep them educated? How do you keep them selling, et cetera? And that's kind of overall at the highest level what sales enablement is all about. It's about enabling revenue generation.
Hi, I'm jumping into the conversation real quick to ask you a very simple, quick favor. If you are enjoying what you're listening to right now, if it's interesting, if it's entertaining, if you're pulling away value, if you're learning something, whatever the case may be, do me a favor and just hit subscribe on your podcast player right now. If it's on your phone, if you're listening on a computer, whatever it is, just take 2 seconds right now, hit subscribe. It helps us. You'll never miss an episode, and everybody wins. And if you really like this content, a lot, come on over to eLearn Magazine, throw your email address in there and subscribe there as well for other great content around our blog posts, around the events we play, and of course, this podcast as well. Thank you very much. And now back to the show. It seems interesting to me that it's totally logical. I was one of my first jobs way back in the, I got a lot of gray hair too, like 20 years ago. I was a technical sales, person. And so I went with the person who was going to sign the contract, and I was the one who was translating, this is what we technically mean, and this is what we mean in actual plain English kind of stuff. Is that what we're talking about here?
It can be given depending on the role, right? If I create some training for a sales rep, it could be something that's based on, for instance, you always hear about the magical triad of people, process, and technology. So a lot of times you're creating training on processes. It could be internal processes, how to order something, how to license it, how to work inside of like Salesforce.com, et cetera. It can be anything like that. It can also be teaching somebody how to demo your product and or your service properly. It's also sometimes just teaching people how to sell and how to listen to prospects, how to identify business problems, how to articulate your solution as a business solution rather than just merely a technical solution. Those types of, so it can be all along that range. Sure.
Okay. Well, for most of the people who are listening right now, they they probably didn't come to learn how to sell. I'm assuming. Let's put the conversation on its head. And so there are many of us out there who either love the LMS, their learning management system that they have. They're looking at what's next, right? 2023 is right around the corner. Everybody's got a new solution. The pandemic has created an urgency and a need for so many people, business continuity. Lots of organizations were caught with their pants down, surprisingly, school districts and whatnot. What are, right off the top of your head, what are the first things that I should be considering when I'm looking at either a new LMS or a new module for my LMS, or, upgrading like the new solution? Like, what are those first questions I need to ask?
Sure. The most important question is actually happens before you even worry about the LMS itself. It's about the provider that you're probably looking at, right? Whether, even if you're going to do this on your own, it doesn't matter. But a lot of people take advantage of services, right? So, LMS services, et cetera. So really, the first thing I recommend for people is take a look at the provider. And is the provider going to be merely a provider, or are they going to be a partner? And there is a huge difference between those two things. And the partner, which I recommend people look for, is somebody who's going to help you meet your business objectives. They're not there just saying, okay, here's a piece of technology, knock yourself out, load some SCORM packages and have people go learn stuff. Because quite frankly, anybody can do that. So I think that's kind of the first thing you have to look at. Once you get into the technology, then there's a lot of other questions that have to come up. You really need to look at kind of where you are as a business and where you want to be in the next, let's say, 5 years as a good runway. And I work with clients, some clients I have that are maybe 100 people to the company. Other clients, almost 100,000 people. Those are very different businesses and very different business needs. So it really, that's, hence the reason I'm a consultant, is because I like looking at those different aspects of the spectrum and helping folks out. But overall, when you're looking at an LMS in general, really you have to look at what are your immediate business needs, and then what are your medium and long term, and find out if it's going to work for you. And some people, unfortunately, I think do try to, as they say, boil the ocean in the beginning, and it never works out. They take on too much. They go with an LMS that maybe it's definitely robust, but it may be overreaching for what they want to do. And sometimes it's better to scale it back. Even if you go with an option that has tons of capabilities, that doesn't mean you have to use every single one of those capabilities from the jump, right? So taking a very strategic look at your business goals and how you can start off and do things effectively and efficiently, and then build over time. And if the LMS has the capabilities to do that, there's all kinds of things that go into that. Things like, how easy or difficult is it to administer on a day-to-day basis? What about the back-end infrastructure and platform? Are you managing that? Is your partner managing it? What goes into that? Of course, the regular capability, there's a lot of kind of capabilities that are considered table stakes these days, and that's fine. Everybody's going to have that. But what else can they do above and beyond that? What else can they integrate with? We are in a world, and we are going more and more toward the SaaS model, right? Everybody's moving to the cloud, including LMS vendors. And what can I do to integrate my other business solutions with my LMS and really have a fully integrated solution, rather than just, oh, this is my education system, but it doesn't talk to my, it doesn't talk to Salesforce, or it doesn't work with meeting providers, whether it's WebEx or Zoom or anybody like that. So those are all big questions that you need to kind of look at as you're prepping.
Cool. Well, I want to back up just a little bit, because I want to think about that spectrum, or maybe that gradient between, sort of a small, let's just call it like a small community college versus like a really large, like, university system. And the considerations, I'd love to hear your opinion on, hey, we've got a technical team, right? Like, we have the resources, we're going to implement it, we're actually going to be, pulling the levers and those kinds of things. Whereas, maybe on the other side, a smaller university or smaller company would be like, we actually really want all the help. We just want to be able to have a person or persons to support some of our professors and those kinds of things. do you have a criteria, or like, here's like 3 big buckets that I put, how you make that decision matrix happen? Or is it truly like you got to kind of come up with your own play card no matter what?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I tend to get a little philosophical with this. Regardless of the size of the client, I kind of say you have to think about, where do you want to spend your time?
Mm-hmm.
And, I remember when I first got into business, when I started my company with like 16, 17 years ago now. And I remember realizing that you have a choice. You can either work in the business or on the business, but you can't do both of them concurrently. And so I talk to people about whether, like you said, it's a small community college or it's a bigger organization. What do you want your people doing? And just because you have the staff maybe to be able to manage the solution and do all that stuff, is that the best use of their time? Or should they be managing something else, what have you? And is it going to be just a more efficient process? Just outside of education, I do this in my own personal life. I think we all do. My wife will give me a hard time, like, you never mow the lawn. No, I don't. I hire somebody else to do that because I don't want to mow my lawn. That's not what I enjoy doing. So even though it's kind of a little bit of a silly example, it's still the way I choose, to spend my time. And I would tell you, regardless of the size of your organization, you have to have a good understanding of what's going to be the best use of your staff's time. And once you do that, I think the answer becomes a lot clearer.
Before we I want to kind of move the script towards, how you look for that partner or provider, right? But before we get there, like, what is your, 1 or 2 go-to pieces of advice to, for lack of a better term, kind of like assuage or prevent that sort of buyer's remorse? Like, so many times, like, we get into those conversations, we get really far down the path, and then, you push go on the contract, right? And it's like, oh man, I didn't know this. Like, what's your answer to that?
Yeah, it's a great thing to think about. I just recently went through this handful of months ago with a client of mine who was looking at 2 different providers. And, fortunately, I was familiar with both providers, and they were asking me for my opinion on which direction to go. But rather than tell them, which I could have done, just like an educator, you can tell somebody something, I wanted them to come to their own conclusion, but I set up the environment so that they could. And what we ended up doing was coming up with really important questions to their organization, and then having meetings with both vendors to see how they answer those questions. And, again, it's a variety of questions. Some of them are technical, some of them are not, some are business related, some of them are process related, some of them are hypothetical. Well, what if? And you really want to see how they respond. And once we did that, the answer was crystal clear. Because there's certain things you just can't fake. And when you ask the right questions, those things come out very, very easily.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, no, as they say, the proof's in the pudding. So that takes me where, I want to go next, which is looking at, there are, we know that there's like a handful of dominant providers in at least the North America market, right? And sort of Europe, North America market. And we could probably name the 4 or 5 that they are. But there are truly, there's everything from Google Classrooms to, some WordPress plugins that you use, in order to provide a learning solution. What are like some of the most common things that you would expect out of the get-go as sort of like, we're not even going to consider this provider unless is it things like, provide a free trial, in their SaaS solution that I can kind of go around and kick the tires? Or is it, I need to be able to talk with a customer support rep, like out of the gate? Or like, what are the things that you recommend to look for in that partner as like sort of definitely like, if they don't do these 5 things, then they shouldn't even be on the table?
Yeah. So, and you named a couple of them, and these are in no particular order, but just off the top of my head, absolutely. If you can't do a trial of the software or whatever the solution is, you're out. I mean, you just have to be able to do that. That's a given. The other thing I tell people to do is start using support before you're a customer, because you want to see what their service is going to be like. So you can use support in pre-sales, and you can say, hey, look, if I have an issue with this, how are we going to resolve this? Or how does this work? And put me in touch with this person and go through that. And if they're not willing to do that in a pre-sales environment to secure the sale, well, then they're sure as heck not going to worry about you once they have your money.
Right.
So I do demand a lot of providers up front to put in the sweat equity, so that when I'm working with my clients, I can show them there's a difference between providers and how they respond to stuff. So I think I would say, yeah, you've definitely got to try out the software. You've definitely got to try out support. You also want to have some meetings with them, and they should want to meet with you. Even if you say, hey, I want to set up a remote meeting for an hour with all these people and talk about this topic. And then the next meeting I want to do for an hour as well. And I want you to bring your security people in, and we were going to do a separate meeting. Now, I'm not advocating that you take advantage of a provider, but you should test them a little bit and see how they react. See if they give you pushback, or, oh, I don't know, that one person who knows that one topic is very busy. Like, oh, well, if they're already busy, adding my workload's not going to help out. You can start to learn things indirectly as well as directly based on those meetings.
Does it matter if, what's the question I'm trying to ask? I'm trying to ask like where people are. Like, we live in a virtual world now. It's all remote. Are we talking in-person meetings, or are your expectation is, look, I at least got to be able to set up a Zoom call or whatever with somebody relatively expediently? Or is this, are there other expectations that you'd want to have in terms of touch points or immediacy?
Yeah, I'm always a bigger fan of in-person meetings when possible, but we're in a different world now, and I understand some of the limitations and what have you around that. But my kind of order of operations is face-to-face handshakes, right? Let's have a meeting face-to-face. Then if we can do it remotely with video, that's fine. And then it moves on to phone call. And then after that, smoke signals or whatever you want to do. But I think that at least remote meetings are the norm now. And also, given the dispersed nature of our workforce, it's really kind of just the way we're going to probably do things moving forward. But they have to be willing to do it. And unfortunately, I have run into providers who have given me pushback, and I'm very honest with them. And I'm like, if you're not willing to do this, you are off the list of potential providers. It's that simple. And they're like, yeah, it's not the way we run our business. That's fine.
It's just what I find. The reason why I asked that as well is because in the SaaS world that we're in, for the newbie who doesn't software as a service, it's increasingly common to buy into a system as a subscription of some sort, and then find yourself 5 layers away from a human, if you can ever get to a human, right? And personally, I've bought into several systems in different kind of universes where it's just like, I'm surprised I have hair left, quite honestly, because it's just like, all I want to do is explain to a human what's happening, because I know I'm getting bot responses, or I'm in a chatbot, never-ending universe. Is that happening in education today, or is it still these things are too big and too monstrous that it's got to be human touch?
Well, when you say in education, I assume you mean more of the solution on how to educate your people, as opposed to. All right,
yeah, with like the platforms we're talking about. I mean, everything from like, because quite frankly, I've never talked to them in a Google Classroom. Like, I don't know, do they have that? Or but I know, like, you can download Moodle today, and you're kind of on your own unless you go to a service provider, right? So there's kind of everything in between, right?
Yeah, and it's tough because when we talk about software as a service and everybody is moving to that SaaS model, there are a lot of great things about it, but there are also some challenges. And one thing I've found interesting over the last 5 to 7 years, probably, maybe even 7 or 8 years, has been this notion of an organization called customer success, right? So a lot of companies now are creating customer success organizations, And what's interesting from my perspective as a consultant is that a lot of people look at customer success and they think, okay, we've got to keep the customer engaged. We got to keep them adopting our features and other things that we do. But the reality is that customer success is, again, about really solving somebody's business problem. So I think that my expectation is that I have the ability on behalf of my clients, or if my clients do it themselves, to reach a human, period.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to, and whatever the SLAs are, I mean, everybody, you can agree on whatever the SLAs are, that's fine. But you have to be able to reach a human in a reasonable time frame. And I think people should expect that. The whole idea of bots and fun stuff like that, I mean, I get it. I understand the value of it, but there are plenty of people who are kind of more what I would call old school. I want to get a person. And
well, I'm also wondering, just since this is going to make it seem like kind of a left field question maybe, but I'm just like, my mind's going right now, like we're increasingly seeing this sort of like concierge, red velvet rope kind of universe that's like that's being pushed out there a lot in social media and whatnot. Do you feel that that's out there as well, where it's like, hey, look, I know that you can do the bot stuff, but I'm special and I want to be treated special. Should I demand that? And at what point can I demand that?
Yeah, honestly, I think you should. And I'm only laughing because I quite literally last night had a conversation with, not related to this specific field, but where I'm the customer. And I told that provider, I said, I realize that I am merely a single customer of yours, but I'm a longtime customer. And do I think that I should be special? Absolutely. I should be special. And even if I'm not special to you, your job is to make me feel that I am. That's your job. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think that people should demand that. And, you have to be reasonable as well and not have unrealistic expectations. But I think, having an open, honest, a frank conversation with what the expectations are. And a lot of times people don't do this until it's too late. You need to do this. You need to do this before the contract is signed. Because a lot of times when you sign a contract, then whatever the SLAs are, that's what they are, and the processes and procedures. If you want that amended, you should absolutely bring it up and say, hey, I'd like your legal team to add a little line here. And that just gives me that sense of comfort and that to know that I'm going to be serviced the way I want to be serviced. And sometimes they're willing to do it. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they'll modify it, but you get nothing if you don't ask. So,
right. 100%.
Absolutely.
Speaking of SLAs or service level agreements, is there anything that I think 99.999% uptime, availability, those kinds of things are no one would even look at a contract that doesn't have something like that from like a SaaS provider. Mm-hmm. Is there another thing that you say, look, you absolutely have to demand this in an SLA or any kind of part like that?
I think it depends on your business. So like my largest clients are global. Well, that changes what support looks like, because all of a sudden now we've got people from, either Europe and or Asia hitting at different times. There's, people work different days of the week as well, depending what country you're in, et cetera. But that doesn't stop. That doesn't mean the business stops. So if you are an international or a global company, you absolutely have to look at support from that perspective. And yes, of course, 5 nines of uptime is kind of the, if you can get it, that's great. Not everybody provides it. I think that's only 12 minutes of downtime a year. But the support is probably the biggest one when you're a global company that I would say you have to look at that. And other things I think you need to be reasonable about, like I talked about using integrations. So if you're integrating things like plugins as an example or whatever, I don't think, there's a saying, it goes something like, your lack of planning does not constitute an emergency on my part.
Right.
And I think that it's up to the customers to also realize that there's such thing as being a good customer or a bad customer. And I think if you're a good customer, you're planning things, you're letting your provider know in advance, hey, we're talking about implementing something like this in 4 months or 6 months. Let's start talking about it now, looking into it, and seeing what value you as a provider can provide to me, other than, yeah, I'm going to plug that thing in for you. I hope it works out. There's things around the security realm, all kinds of things when it comes to integration of different systems like single sign-on, HRIS, compliance issues, and different things that companies have to worry about. And like it or not, it trickles down to the provider as well.
I want to go to security next, because that's the first thing. We've had Dr. Chuck Severance on the show a couple of times, and we've been beaten. We've been beaten across the brow about security issues. So I want to talk about that. But before we to wrap up this partner, where do you stand on references? Because one of the things that I always like to do is say, hey, look, show me what you've done before, or like actually give me like a real, again, human to talk to about this experience. How do you usually deal with that? Because obviously a company is going to throw out their star customer or two, or the one person they know they have a great relationship with. Is there a tip or trick of the trade that you say when looking at that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think references, it goes back to the same thing with resumes, right? Nobody in their right mind is going to put a reference on a resume of somebody who's going to say, oh, that person's a schmuck, don't hire them, right? So every once in a while it happens, but as a rule, it doesn't. But a lot of times, I do think it's important to get references, but I also think it's important to talk with those references and, again, ask them the right questions. And there is no such thing as a perfect relationship. So, I will always ask and say, look, I know you guys have had struggles before. Give me a couple examples of those struggles and how they went down. And that will tell you a lot, because everybody knows it's easy to be a great provider when things are good, but the test of anyone's mettle is when things go wrong. How do you react to that? And when you talk to references about that, yes, do you want to know the good stuff so that you can anticipate having happiness in those areas? For sure. But finding out about a couple challenges, and if they tell you there weren't any, they're full of crap, because there are challenges always. But again, how was it handled? Right? And is the provider also good at taking feedback? I've had to have sometimes rather difficult conversations with a provider and say, hey, here's how you handled this with my client. This isn't going to work for me moving forward. Let me explain why. And I would expect different. Can you provide different when we move forward? Yes. Okay, great. Then we're good to go. But again, difficult conversations, but they need to be had.
Awesome. So take me to the security mindset. I know this is a place, it's something of a passion of yours. It's a place that you think about a lot, especially when we're thinking about a SaaS service provider, because data is stored somewhere else and compliance is a thing, and security protocols, the moat around your system is handled by somebody else. What are, again, what's that top 5 questions that you ask or you look for in a solution in order to make sure that they're compliant with what you need, just kind of out of the gate?
Yeah, I would say the number one criterion I think that security experts would look for in a SaaS provider is being SOC 2 certified, and being able to show. And this has been going on for decades, right? I remember being an engineer.
For people, before people know, so is SOC 2? Is that a independent certification, or how does that work?
I forgot the name of the organization. There's whoever hosts it, and then you can get an independent third-party auditor to come through and go through the process, and you have to identify and validate all your security controls that fall in various areas and how you protect your own and customer data.
Okay.
And then once you do that, then bam, you get the rubber stamp of approval, SOC 2 certification. And that allows all of your potential customers to know that you not only know and understand security, but you've implemented it properly in your solution. And it makes a big difference. Sure. And I mentioned, even when I was an engineer, 20 plus years ago, an organization that I worked for, we went through, it wasn't SOC 2 because that didn't exist then, but the predecessor to that, we went through that certification, and we were the only provider of our type to have it at that point in time. And it makes a huge difference, obviously, in your ability to sell. But another thing is that when you as a company go out to get cyber insurance. One of the things they're going to ask you is, hey, you know, what have you done with your current SaaS providers to make sure that you've mitigated risk, or that they have, or both? And if you say, oh, we went with this organization because they're SOC 2 certified, well, that's going to make a bigger difference in the premium that you're going to pay. It's going to go down because they know that they have a more secure solution than anybody else. So SOC 2 certification is a big deal, and a lot of SaaS providers are working toward it if they don't already have it. It's pretty common. That's on kind of a macro level. Now, as you go down and start digging in a little bit more deeply, then you have to look at how are they handling specifically the customer, your data, because you as an organization will be sharing PII with them, personally identifiable information. And depending on what regulations you have to abide by, things like HIPAA, you know, in the healthcare world, PCI DSS for credit card stuff, GDPR, privacy, et cetera, all of those things go into it. So you need to make sure when you're picking a provider that you understand how they're handling those data and what you can and can't do with it. So that definitely becomes a challenge and an issue, and you have to usually address it in the contract and make sure that you know what's going on.
Fantastic. Is there anything like around those data security and compliance issues? Like, should I expect them to come to us and say, "Hey, are you thinking about GDPR? Are you thinking about, you know, like," or is that something where I come with my menu and I'm like, "Hey, can you show me how you know how to deal with this?"
I think you have to. I'm going to put on my provider hat for a minute and say it kind of depends on the situation. If I go into a meeting with a potential client and they're not asking those questions, I'm probably not going to bring it up, because again, you know, once you get the yes, just shut your mouth and walk out, right? So I don't think you necessarily need to bring it up, but I think you need to be ready for it. And if you're talking with a customer who maybe they're not familiar with the SaaS market in LMSs, but they are security savvy, and you know that would absolutely be the time to bring it up and say, by the way, I know how, you know, sophisticated you are with security. Here's something about us that you should know. And that will make a huge difference in that sales cycle. So again, I think you have to read the audience, and if you don't need to bring it up, don't. And you know, and if it's going to help you make a sale, absolutely. And be honest with where you are in the process, what you can and can't do. And again, to drill in one level lower, now you're talking, because before we talked about SOC 2, SaaS, you know, large scale security. Then we moved down a little bit more deeply into compliance regulation, PII. Well, now move down one level deeper into the actual, for instance, the plugins that you're going to use, right? Does the provider have the ability to look at code and understand what potential vulnerabilities may exist and be able to tell me? I might say, hey, I want to use this cool whiz bang plugin because it's going to let me do this. Well, I want them to be able to have the skill set to say, we're going to do a security review on that, and we're going to let you know if there are any potential ramifications. And I just went through this recently with a provider where they said, we're going to recommend you not use this plugin, and here's why. And my client looked at it and said, okay, I appreciate it. I understand it. It's great. We think the risk of that vulnerability being exploited is so low in our environment that we're willing to accept the risk of that. And, you know, the provider was like, okay, that's cool. But the point was, they brought it to us. They let us know proactively. And that's another very important piece of security.
I honestly, it kind of fills my heart with a little bit of joy that somebody had the entrepreneurial spirit to say, you know what, we appreciate it. Because I feel like every time I get into one of those conversations, especially when you take it to either a security expert or a lawyer or some kind, they're just be like, no. You know, it's like, if there is a risk, we're going to say no. And to hear another organization say, well, you know what, we get it, but we think it's such a small risk. Mm-hmm. Talk to me about, you know, I think it's so easy to get caught up in the conversation around the provider security and everything's in the cloud and whatnot. Is it still true that kind of the number one security protocol in every large organization is still like the humans inside the organizations, right? Like, walking out with a laptop or giving away a password or those kinds of, do I still have that right?
Oh yeah. Our biggest vulnerability is the human vulnerability, and it probably always will be. And that part is true. What I think is interesting though is how providers, especially SaaS providers, are starting to try to mitigate the risk around that. As an example, I happen to know of a story of a client, not my client, but somebody else's client, who went to publish some training material, and they thought they were publishing it for one audience, and they were actually publishing it for a different audience. And that audience was not allowed to see, or should not have been able to see, some of that content.
Sure.
Well, that's problematic,
Sure.
right? And so now, one provider, which I think it was just silly the way they did this. They said, well, we're just not going to be a provider for that side of the house anymore. We're only going to appeal to this one audience, right? So if you take two audiences, you say internal versus partner. This company was like, that's all right, we're not doing internal anymore. We're just going to do partner stuff, then we don't have to worry about it. Well, it's not a very mature answer, right? Mm-hmm. The mature answer is, okay, we understand there's a business problem here and a very real risk. Instead, what can we do to put in controls to mitigate that risk happening? And it can be different things. It could be something as simple as a visual cue for the administrator that when they're doing internal stuff, maybe the background is green. When they're doing partner stuff, the background is red, something like that, just to say, okay, I know where I am. And then, also pop-up warnings and, things like that make them hopefully think twice. But without a doubt, the human element is still the largest vulnerability, but we are getting better and better as an industry in trying to predict, because a lot of people do similar, they do the same behavior, right? It's one behavior, but a million people are doing it. So how do we either train them out of doing it, like phishing emails, don't click on things that you don't know what they are, and yet people still do it all the time.
So kind of final security question as we wrap this up. I'm already taking you a lot of time out of your busy day, but how forgiving should I be as a corporation or a school or whatever who's hired one of these providers and there is a security breach? I guess we've almost come to the day and age where we kind of hear about these things every week, if not, even more regularly. I'm going to leave it right there. Talk to me about that. Like, should I be forgiving at all? Should I, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, well, I think if you talk to anybody, like I've been involved in InfoSec for 25 years now. So my opinion on it may be a little bit different than just the casual observer. But, it's, you only have two types of companies out there, those who have been breached and those who have been breached and don't know it, right? So I usually go into the mindset of, look, something's going to happen at some point. But that's why things like doing your due diligence and looking at SOC 2 and other controls that the company has put in place. So you realize that there is an element of risk, but they've done what they can to mitigate it. I think that you have to be somewhat understanding, because none of us have zero vulnerabilities. It doesn't work that way. So I think you have to be a little bit understanding. And again, what I think is even more important and the breach can be from something kind of, for lack of a better term, stupid, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of times it can be just something dumb. Somebody clicks on something, a Trojan horse gets downloaded. Next thing you know, PII is running out the door and all that. Like, I get it. But what's more important, I think, is the reaction of the organization to it. Number one, do they acknowledge it? Do they own up to it? Do they say, there's been a problem, and they don't wait 3 or 4 weeks to tell you, right? They come out and they say proactively, there's been a problem. Here's what happened. Here's how we're handling it now. Here's what we're doing to make the situation better immediately. And then long-term, we have plans on how we're going to mitigate this going forward. So again, it's the reaction to bad things that says more about the organization than the fact that bad things happen to them, because they happen to all of us.
Fantastic. John Hackmeyer, better known as Hack to the people who know you well, who've been, you've been in this industry for quite a while now. Cyber Crocodile is your company. I can't thank you enough for this. It's been just one of those super meaty conversations, straight to the point kind of stuff. But with that touch of, you've been around for 25 years, and there is perspective. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day to speak with me.
Oh, thank you. I had a blast, and looking forward to doing it again based on customer demand.
Excellent.
Thank you again for listening to the eLearn podcast. I just wanted to take one last moment here to ask you to, if you enjoyed this episode, if you learned something, if you had fun, if you liked the guest, if you wanted to learn more, if you feel like sharing this with somebody, do me a favor. Hit subscribe on your podcast player right now. Just do it right now before the episode ends. Hit subscribe, and that way you'll never miss an episode as we publish them every week. Thanks.